It was July 1914, in one of the most lifeless corners of the Arctic. Valerian Albanov could barely stand. The jagged and endless sea ice had taken its toll. His boots were disintegrating and his legs were torn and frostbitten. And believe it or not, he was one of the lucky ones. The freezing temperatures, broken ice, and starvation had claimed most of the men he had sailed with. The sea ice stretched for hundreds of kilometers. A wasteland they had just crossed on foot. There was no map to follow. They were in completely uncharted territory. And somewhere out there, behind the fog and the ice floes, was a ship frozen in the ice pack. The Santa Ana became trapped in the ice over a year ago, drifting helplessly into the frozen reaches of the Arctic. In a desperate attempt to survive, Albanov had left the helpless ship and staked everything on reaching land in hope of rescue. When he finally finds shore, he's met with a land that's barren and lifeless, and it certainly seemed that it would take a miracle at this point for Albanov to survive. This is a story of a crew who had to endure the absolute worst conditions the Arctic had to throw at them, and one man who tried to save them all. Let's jump into the history of the Brusilov Expedition. It was the summer of 1912. A ship departed from the northern coast of Russia, headed not for any port, but into the ice. The mission was to sail through the Northeast Passage, a sea route skimming the top of Siberia. While most would know the Northwest Passage through Canada, this was literally its mirror image on the other side of the world, a frozen corridor connecting Europe to the Pacific by way of the Kara Sea. At the helm was a naval officer named Georgy Brusilov, who was young, ambitious, and hardened by earlier Arctic expeditions. He believed that with the right crew and enough preparation, he could do what others only dreamed of. And one of those crew members was Valerian Albanov, his navigator. He was quiet, calculated, and more prepared for hardship than anyone could have guessed. Their ship, the Santa Ana, had once flown a British flag, a wooden gun vessel retrofitted for the Arctic. Its hull was reinforced and its steam engine overhauled to handle the grueling winter conditions. And this thing, before their expedition, is literally packed to the beams. They prepared themselves for 2 winters, maybe even more. They brought canned beef, salt pork, dried peas, and a lot of buckwheat. They also brought with them barrels of lime juice to stave off scurvy, and enough coal to stave off frostbite for the entire time they would be out there. In addition to the food and heat, the crew of Santa Ana also brought with them 15 sled dogs to help move gear around during the journey. On paper, this expedition looked solid, but in reality, they were sailing into one of the most unforgiving places on Earth, with no radio, no chance of rescue if things went wrong, and certainly to a place with no second chances. It was late August of 1912 when the Santa Ana steamed north from the Kola Peninsula. Her bow pointed towards the Kara Sea. Spirits were very high. The men joked on the deck, watching for whales and seabirds. The departure was smooth sailing overall. However, there was some minor problems that they would run into along the way. First off was a delay along the coast, where they had to double check some of the bearings. They had to stop at one point and recalibrate their compass as they moved into further northern latitudes, and at one point they had to wait out a storm a little longer than expected. These were just minor issues and a few small choices that were made without panic. But in the Arctic, the tiniest of decisions can determine your fate. They were supposed to reach the Kara Sea by early September, but the small delays along the way had cost them almost a month. At this point, it was early October, and the sea was freezing over in places they didn't expect, choking off their path in most directions. They knew at this point that they would have to break ice to stay ahead of the full freeze. At first they pressed on, firing the bullers hot, weaving between leads of slush and ice. But the path kept narrowing, and the ice kept building in every direction they could see. And by mid-October, they knew they were past the point of no return. Just north of the Yamal Peninsula, the ice swallowed the ship completely. The crew scrambled, hacking at pressure ridges and ramming at full speed backwards and frontwards trying to break the ice. But nothing they tried worked. The ship became completely frozen in the ice. And for now, wherever the ice pack went, the Santa Ana would helplessly follow. The Kara Sea stretched in every direction, a flat white desert broken only by the creaking of ice and the cry of the wind. Out here, there was no shelter besides the ship. Shortly after they froze in place, their worst fears seemed to be coming true. Slowly the Arctic winds picked up, and they began to drift further and further from shore. The men understood how helpless they were in this situation and knew that all they could try to do was keep the ship livable and everyone healthy. Immediately, they sealed off all of the hatches and packed snow high against the hull for insulation. They nailed canvas over the bunks to keep everyone warm, and they stuffed every crack they could with cloth and wool. This would help them preserve as much fuel as possible because they didn't know how long they would be out there. Inside the ship, the coal stove was literally their lifeline. It glowed red through the dark and had to burn day and night just to keep people from getting frostbite. They had to ration their heat like food. Every shovelful of coal was one less for the months ahead, and by late October, the Arctic night had begun. And for the next 4 months, there would be no sunrise, just howling wind, the groan of shifting ice, and the creak of wood under pressure. This wasn't just a problem that was going to put them behind schedule, because the one thing that was consistent day to day was that this ship was drifting further and further from land and rescue. The first winter was dark and brutal, but it did eventually pass. And when the sun finally returned in 1913, the crew hoped a thaw would break them free. It didn't. The ice held fast. Summer came and went without a single crack wide enough to break free. And as the months dragged on, the drift continued slow and silent and unrelenting, until they entered their second winter. And here they were, still carrying out their everyday, desperate attempt to survive by rationing out what little food they had left and clinging to the little bit of coal that was keeping them just alive, knowing that at any minute, the ice could crush the ship and it would all be taken away from them. The crew spent their days literally just subsisting on what they had brought with them and trying to stay alive. And by the spring of 1914, the Santa Ana had drifted further north than any of them had imagined. The ice had carried them more than 1,000 kilometers from where they'd first been trapped. And now, here they were, well beyond 83 degrees north, into a part of the Arctic where no ship had ever stayed a winter, let alone survived. This area was not charted very well at the time, and I can only imagine the fear that these guys were experiencing every day. At this point, the sun had returned, and the temperatures did rise, but the ship didn't budge. In the far reaches of the Arctic, the ice will often persist throughout the summer, and for the Santa Ana, she was still caught and as helpless as ever. The crew was well aware that her hull was not meant to withstand the pressure of the ice, and that at any moment they could be left without food or shelter. That long winter really took a toll on people, and Captain Brusilov was said to not even leave his bunk at this point. His strength was completely gone, his bones were aching, and his gums were bleeding. It was almost certainly scurvy, and in that state, he wasn't able to command anymore. And that's when Valerian Albanov, the navigator and log keeper, stepped up and started making decisions. An interesting point here is that though lime juice was often brought on these voyages to fight off scurvy, one thing that was not well understood at the time was how quickly it could degrade, especially at different temperatures. So it's there, but it's not always a bulletproof answer to preventing scurvy. Albanov's decision was a dramatic one. He decided that he would leave, not to abandon the Santa Ana, not just to survive. He wanted to find land and reach help. He was going to come back with rescue before it was too late for everybody. He approached Captain Brusilov and he asked his permission to lead a breakaway party across the ice. And it was said that it wasn't granted easily, but eventually Brusilov went along with it, quietly and without ceremony, but it was agreed. Albanov would make the trek to find help. 13 men volunteered to follow Albanov, and each of them gathered what they could. Skis, 2 sledges, a few hand-built kayaks made from salvaged wood and canvas, a few of the remaining dogs, rifles, and a small portion of the last of the remaining food. The man had a plan to reach a place called Cape Flora, a place they believed that used to house a British outpost built years earlier by somebody named Frederick Jackson, and it was on the edge of Franz Josef Land. Nobody was sure that it actually existed anymore, but they figured it was their best hope. On April 13th, 1914, they set off. One by one, the men stepped down from the frozen deck and began hauling their sledges across the pack. There was no trail, just a wilderness of blue shadow and white glare. Their goal was simple: to walk until they could reach open water and then paddle south towards Franz Josef Land and maybe give them a chance of rescue. And the walk wasn't going to be easy because the Arctic pack ice wasn't still. It rose and fell with the sea, groaning and creaking like the hull of the ship. There was pressure ridges that surged upwards, and twisted slabs taller than most of the men. There was leads in the ice that opened like trapdoors, exposing the water below. A single wrong step could literally mean death for these guys. They had to move slow, pulling their overloaded sledges and dragging the kayaks made of canvas. At night, they would bury themselves into shallow snow pits or huddle beside the sledges, throwing a little bit of canvas over themselves to block the wind and conserve whatever heat they could. Sometimes, the ice would tilt under them as they slept. A few of the sled dogs had come with them, weak and gaunt, but the ice showed no mercy to these dogs. Some were injured, some starved, and others were killed for their meat. They just didn't last long. And Albanov was doing his best to navigate for these men to make sure they were headed in the right direction, but it was really hard to guess their navigation overall because of the drifting ice and the lack of accurate maritime charts in that area for the time. And when you're walking across endless white in every direction, it could be super disorienting. So I can imagine it truly was something that was a little unsettling for these guys, not knowing what direction they were truly headed at any given time. And it didn't take long, though, into this journey before the men started to become exhausted. One man fell into the ice and he was gone, taken by the sea, while another literally froze in his sleep. The group shrank each week. Men who'd once marched together fell behind, others would lay down and not get back up. At some point, Albanov stopped writing the names of the dead because at this point, they felt like the situation was so desperate they couldn't spare any time and had to keep moving. Their survival instinct had really kicked in and nothing mattered but living now. They marched for weeks until they finally spotted open water. And sadly, there was only 2 of them that were still alive and had the strength to climb into the patch kayaks and start paddling towards rescue. 11 men had perished on that walk in search of rescue. The only 2 survivors at this point were Valerian Albanov and a man named Alexander Conrad, and it would be these 2 who would paddle the hearts out until they reached Cape Flora, their legs trembling after months of dragging sleds, dodging open ice, paddling on the open sea, and burying their dead. They were so exhausted when they finally reached solid ground that they literally collapsed. They searched up and down the coast desperately looking for shelter, and what they found was a small hut, abandoned years before by the British expedition I had mentioned earlier. But this place, unfortunately for them, was more of a ruin than a refuge. Its roof sagged, and the stove was rusted over. But to them, it meant walls to block the wind, and maybe, just maybe, a chance at survival. They salvaged whatever they could. Old and rotting canvas, scrapping old tea tins to melt snow for water, and even picking up driftwood along the beach to reinforce the walls to keep the snow and wet off them. There was so little driftwood to fuel their fires that they lit no signal fires in hopes of rescue. All they could do was save the little bit they could salvage with the energy they had to keep just warm enough to stay alive. And each day, all they could really do at this point to conserve energy was watch the horizon, hoping that a silhouette of a ship would appear and rescue would find them. And back on the Santa Ana, it was still frozen, somewhere in that pack, and it was still adrift. And at this point, Albanov had no idea where the location of that ship would even be, because he knew one thing, it certainly didn't stop drifting. He wondered if anyone else in the ship at this point had actually tried to follow them. Was anyone on the crew still alive, or had the ship been crushed and sank beneath the ice? For them, Cape Flora really offered no answers. It was just a place to subsist and stay alive. One morning, in late July, while staring out into the endless gray, a dark shape cut through the fog. It was a ship, and this time it wasn't a hallucination. The men scrambled to light a signal fire with what little driftwood they had, and slowly the smoke began curling desperately into the air. The vessel, named the St. Foca, was on its own expedition, and that's when its crew noticed the signal sent from ashore. They sent a small boat ashore with a few crew members, and when they arrived, Albanov could barely speak. He tried to garner up the strength to utter out one message, and it was simply that there's others still out there and we have to go back. The men were barely clinging to life, and the crew of the St. Foca immediately brought them aboard, provided them with food and shelter, enough to get them to a point where they're somewhat healthy, at least to survive the journey south. The men were brought to a place called Varda, Norway, and it was the closest port reachable by sea. And the Norwegians were able to continue nursing them back to health until the men were able to regain their strength. As soon as Albanov could, he started demanding that a rescue be sent for the St. Anna, that it was still out there and you guys gotta send somebody. He wasn't well enough to go himself, but he was able to hand over the coordinates to authorities and create a rough map of the ice drift. He tried to give every little detail he had logged since his ship was trapped. At this point though, he didn't know if anyone survived, but he knew they could be out there and waiting for rescue just like he was on Franz Josef Land. So the Norwegians sent a message to Russia, and Russia listened. And in the summer of 1914, only months after Albanov had left the Santa Ana, they sent rescue ships into the Kara Sea. They did everything they could to retrace the likely path of the Santa Ana and tried to calculate its drift with the pack ice. They scanned every ice floe, checked every abandoned hut on any remote piece of land up there they could find, and checked with other vessels in the area to see if they had seen anything. But at this point, they were finding absolutely zero sign of the Santa Ana anywhere. They found no bodies, no gear, no signal fires, nothing but ice in every single direction. The trail literally ended in silence, and it was as if the ship had been swallowed whole by the ice. And at this point, that's when the authorities presumed all were lost at sea. Of the 34 men who had set aboard the Santa Ana, only 2 ever walked free: Valerian Albanov and Alexander Conrad. It was most likely that the ship was crushed and sank below the ice, and for Albanov, he did survive, but he didn't stay silent. And within a year of returning home, he published a memoir about the expedition called In the Land of the White Death. It's a raw and unsettling account, and the pages are filled with the harrowing journey that these men took in hope of rescue. Unfortunately, though, he never did get to find out, like all of us, whatever happened to the Santa Ana. Nobody did. And after that, Albanov slowly faded from public life, but Albanov's refusal to stay silent kept the story of the Santa Ana alive and inspired multiple attempts to look for the ship. For decades, nobody found a single trace of the Santa Ana, and some people even doubted Albanov's story. But it wasn't until 2010, nearly 100 years later, that a Russian expedition traced Albanov's route using his journal. And on Franz Josef Land, they came across remnants of a camp. At first they thought it was Albanov's because here was bones, boots, some rusted gear, and even a pair of Arctic snow goggles. But they realized that this is something else. This wasn't Albanov's camp. The evidence pointed to something far more tragic. At some point after Albanov's departure, it appeared others from the Santa Ana had tried to escape as well. A second group, perhaps driven by hunger, despair, or likely the sinking of the ship. What we do know is they headed south across the same deadly ice, but unfortunately, they would never find rescue. The bones and the torn gear was really the first clue of what happened to the Santa Ana almost 100 years later. And there was another expedition in 2016 that was trying to retrace Albanov's route again in hopes of finding any trace of the ship's wreckage or anything at all related to the Santa Ana. And tragically, the helicopter crashed and 3 researchers were killed. The mission was halted, and it seemed like the wreck of the Santa Ana claimed even more victims 100 and something years later. And to this day, no one has ever found the actual wreck of the Santa Ana. No sunken timbers, no final resting place, and really no clues to the fate of the actual ship. The only thing that we know is 2 men survived, and others may have tried and were never able to find rescue. The story of the Brusilov Expedition is definitely a reminder of just how harsh conditions are in the Arctic. Only 2 people survived the entire ordeal. And I can't imagine what those guys went through, but I can imagine it changed them forever. I just want to thank you for joining in again this week, and I'll be back again next week with another story.